They left her there to send a message, not to end a life. Elias Mercer saw the shape before he understood it, a dark outline against the pale Wyoming sky, swaying slightly from the broad limb of a cedar that stood alone about 50 yards off the dirt road leading into Dry Creek. His gelding slowed on its own, ears twitching, hooves pressing soft into the dust, as if the morning itself had grown heavy. The sun had barely cleared the low hills, casting long amber light across the prairie, catching on the edge of a wooden sign that hung against the girl's chest. From a distance, it looked like driftwood caught in a fence line. Up close, Elias could read the words burned deep into the plank. "White man don't forgive." The letters were uneven, carved by someone with more anger than skill. The rope above her was tied firm, but not cruelly. Whoever had done this had measured the drop, had made certain she would be found. The girl was young, maybe 17, boots a size too large for her small frame, dark hair falling forward to hide most of her face. Her hands were bound in front, not behind, as if even the ones who put her there had hesitated at the last step. Elias did not speak. He dismounted slowly, the leather of his saddle creaking in the quiet, the only other sound the wind pushing through dry grass stretching for miles in every direction. He had lived alone on his spread 12 miles north for nearly 8 years, long enough to know the difference between justice and performance. This was performance. This was fear dressed up as righteousness. He stepped closer, boots crunching over gravel, and studied the girl's shallow breathing, the faint rise and fall beneath the sign. Alive. Whoever had done this wanted her shamed, not buried. A warning nailed into flesh and wood without a single nail. Elias reached up and steadied the rope with one hand, stopping the slow sway. Her eyes fluttered open at the touch, dark and unfocused at first, then sharpening when they found his face. There was no pleading in them, only exhaustion and something else he recognized too well, resignation. He had seen that look on men who had lost everything but pride. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she had done. The prairie did not care for explanations, and neither did mobs. He removed his hat, setting it on the ground, and examined the knot securing the line to the branch, noting the fresh scrape marks where a ladder must have leaned. Dry Creek was 3 miles east. 3 miles was not far for anger to travel. A meadowlark called somewhere beyond the fence line. It sung thin and out of place in the tension of the morning. Elias drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of memory settle in his chest. His wife's grave beneath a cottonwood, the whispers that had followed her death, the way townspeople decided stories before facts. He looked again at the sign, at the words carved deep enough to scar the wood. "White man don't forgive." The sentence sat wrong, like a lie told too often to question. Elias reached up, braced his boots against the trunk, and began to work at the knot, not with haste, not with anger, but with the steady patience of a man who understood that sometimes the loudest stand a person could make was the quiet refusal to walk away. The knot gave way inch by inch beneath Elias Mercer's steady hands, fibers loosening against calloused fingers that had mended fence lines in winter wind and stitched torn saddle straps by lantern light. He did not rush. The prairie did not reward panic. When the rope slackened enough, he braced one boot against the trunk and lowered her carefully, guiding her weight down until her boots touched the ground, and then the rest of her followed, unsteady but standing. The sign knocked softly against her chest before he lifted it away, the wood warm already from the rising sun. Up close, he could see the smoke-darkened grooves of each letter, could almost imagine the hand that carved them, the pauses where the blade had pressed harder. He untied her wrists without comment, working the stiff cord free. Red marks circled her skin, but she did not complain. She watched him the way a stray watches a stranger with food in his hand, unsure whether to trust the offering. "Can you stand?" he asked at last, voice low and even. She nodded once. Her voice, when it came, was rough from thirst. They said it was only for a while. Elias glanced toward the road that led east, 3 miles to Dry Creek, where whitewashed storefronts and false fronts tried to look respectable against endless sky. "Who was they?" he asked. She swallowed. "Men who lost cattle last month. They said someone had to answer for it." Elias studied her face now that her hair had fallen back, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that held more endurance than fear. "Did you?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I was working at the Wilkes sheep camp. I have been there since spring." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from town. Morning had settled fully over the plains, turning the grass silver and gold. Elias picked up the sign and weighed it in his hands. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of the wood, but because of what it meant. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lila," she said. "Lila Redbird." He nodded once. "Elias Mercer." He did not offer more. Names were enough for now. In the distance, a rider appeared on the rise, small against the horizon, but moving steady toward them. Elias recognized the posture before the face. Sheriff Calvin Rhodes sitting stiff in the saddle, hat pulled low though there was nothing yet to hide from the sun. Elias set his hat back on his head and stepped slightly in front of Lila, not shielding her, just placing himself where conversation would have to pass through him first. The sheriff reined in about 20 feet away, boots creaking as he shifted in the stirrups. His eyes flicked from Elias to the rope still hanging loose from the cedar branch, then to the sign in Elias's hand. "You should not have interfered," Rhodes said, though the words lacked force. Elias looked at him for a long moment, then down at the plank. "Seems to me," he replied quietly, "that whoever did this interfered first." The wind lifted again, tugging at the rope overhead, making it tap softly against the bark, a hollow sound that carried farther than any raised voice could. Calvin Rhodes did not dismount right away. He stayed in the saddle as if height might lend him authority the morning had already taken from him. His horse shifted under him, uneasy with the scent of rope and tension. Elias Mercer held the wooden sign at his side, not hiding it, not displaying it, simply letting it exist between them like a question no one wanted to answer. Lila stood a step behind him, shoulders straight despite the tremor in her breathing. The prairie stretched wide and indifferent beyond the cedar, 10 miles of open land before the first fence line marked ownership. Out here, there were no witnesses except sky and wind, and yet everyone in Dry Creek would claim they had seen nothing. "It was not meant to go this far," Rhodes said finally, eyes fixed somewhere near Elias's boots. "They only wanted to make a point." Elias glanced up at the loose rope tapping the trunk above them. "Looks to me like they made one," he replied. The sheriff cleared his throat. He was a broad man, but softness had settled into him over the years, the kind that came from too many compromises and not enough sleep. "Cattle have been missing," he said. "Folks are angry. They believe someone from the camps is helping thieves move stock through the canyon." Lila stepped forward before Elias could speak. "I have not left the sheep camp in 2 weeks," she said, voice steady now. "Mrs. Wilkes can tell you." Rhodes looked at her then, really looked, as if noticing for the first time that she was not a rumor or a symbol, but a young woman with dust on her boots and fear she was working hard to bury. "You understand how it looks?" he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Elias shifted his weight, boots grinding small stones into the dirt. "What looks worse?" he asked quietly. "A few head of cattle gone missing, or a girl left hanging off a tree to teach a lesson?" The sheriff flinched at the word hanging, though there had been no mention of harm. Silence settled heavy again, thicker now because it carried blame. In the distance, 2 more riders appeared on the ridge, slowing when they saw the small gathering by the cedar. Word traveled fast in a town built on suspicion. Rhodes followed Elias's gaze and stiffened. "You should take her out of sight," he muttered, "before this becomes something I cannot manage." Elias studied him for a long moment, measuring not the badge pinned to his vest but the man beneath it. "It already is," he said. He bent, picked up the coil of rope from the ground, and looped it over his arm, not as evidence, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Then he turned slightly toward Lila. "My place is 12 miles north," he said. "There is water and a spare room." He did not ask her to trust him. He did not promise protection. He simply stated a fact. Lila looked once toward Dry Creek, where the rooftops barely showed over the rise, then back at the cedar tree that had nearly become her marker. "I will come," she said. Rhodes watched them both, the weight of his silence heavier than any order he might have given, and for the first time that morning, he looked smaller than the land he was supposed to keep in line. Elias Mercer did not look back at the cedar as he helped Lila mount his horse, steadying the stirrup with one hand while she gathered what strength she had left. He walked beside the gelding instead of riding, leading the reins loosely, choosing distance from the town over speed. The prairie opened northward in long rolling stretches of grass and sage, the morning sun climbing higher, drying the last of the dew into a faint shimmer that blurred the horizon. Behind them, the riders on the ridge lingered, dark silhouettes against the light, watching but not yet following. Elias felt their eyes the way a man feels weather changing before the clouds arrive. After half a mile, Lila spoke. "They will say you chose a side." Elias kept his gaze ahead. "Out here," he answered, "there are not many sides. Only what you can live with when the sun goes down." She considered that, fingers gripping the saddle horn as the horse moved steady beneath her. The rope he had taken from the tree was looped over his shoulder, brushing against his coat with each step, a quiet reminder that some lines should not be drawn in the first place. The land grew more rugged as they traveled north, low draws cutting through the prairie, cottonwoods gathering near a thin creek that wound like a silver thread through the dust. 12 miles was a long walk, but Elias preferred the silence of it. Silence gave a man room to measure his choices. Around midday, they reached a split-rail fence that marked the boundary of his spread. Beyond it stood a modest ranch house of weathered boards, a barn leaning slightly with age, and a windmill turning slow against the blue. It was not much, but it was honest. Elias opened the gate and led the horse through, closing it carefully behind them as if shutting out more than just open land. He guided Lila down from the saddle and handed her a canteen from the porch. She drank in small, careful swallows, as though afraid even water might be taken away. "You can rest inside," he said. "There is stew from last night. It is plain, but it will fill you." She nodded, eyes scanning the yard, the fence lines, the open sky beyond. "You live alone?" she asked. Elias paused, glancing toward a lone cottonwood near the creek where a simple wooden marker stood, no name carved deep enough to be read from a distance. "Yes," he said. He did not explain further. The wind picked up in the afternoon, rattling the barn door and carrying with it a faint echo from the south, the distant rhythm of hooves on hard ground. Elias heard it before Lila did. He set the rope down on the porch rail and watched the horizon, where small figures were beginning to form against the glare. Dry Creek was coming north, not in a rush, not yet in anger, but in curiosity sharpened by pride. Elias rested one hand on the porch post, steady and unhurried. He had not chosen a side for the town. He had chosen one for himself. And sometimes, that was enough to draw a line no rope could ever hold. The riders from Dry Creek reached the fence line just as the sun began to lean west, their horses blowing dust into the warm afternoon air. There were 6 of them now, spread out in a loose line as if space alone could make them look larger. Elias Mercer remained on the porch, one boot hooked over the lower rail, hat pulled low to shade his eyes. Lila stood just inside the open doorway behind him, not hidden, but not offered either. The windmill turned slow above the well, creaking with each rotation, the only sound between them until Sheriff Calvin Rhodes rode forward a few steps ahead of the others. He had removed his badge from his vest pocket and held it loosely in his hand, not pinned, not displayed. "We came to talk," Rhodes called out, voice carrying across the yard. Elias nodded once. "Then talk." The men behind the sheriff shifted in their saddles. Among them was Thomas Wilkes, owner of the sheep camp where Lila had worked, his jaw tight, eyes restless. Next to him sat Harold Dunn, who had lost 3 head of cattle the previous month and had been the loudest voice in town ever since. Their anger was not loud now. It had thinned into something sharper, more personal. "You know why this happened," Dunn said, leaning forward slightly. "Stock does not vanish without help." Elias stepped down from the porch and walked a few feet into the yard, stopping where the sun hit full on his shoulders. "And you know what you did this morning," he replied calmly. Dunn's gaze flicked toward the house, then back. "We did not harm her." Elias held up the wooden sign he had brought from the cedar, the carved letters catching the light. "You call this nothing?" No one answered. The prairie seemed to listen. Wilkes cleared his throat. "She has worked honest," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "My wife vouches for her." Dunn turned toward him sharply. "Then who?" he demanded. "Someone is feeding information." Gates left unlatched. Trails marked. Rhodes raised a hand, not commanding, only weary. "Enough," he said. He looked at Elias. "We should settle this without tearing the town apart." Elias studied each face in turn, men he had traded with, ridden beside during roundups, shared coffee with at dawn. "Then start by looking where you have not looked," he said. "North Canyon. Fresh tracks run that way after every storm. I saw them myself 2 days ago. A murmur moved through the riders. Dunn frowned. North Canyon leads toward your range. The words hung there, heavy as a challenge. Elias did not flinch. Then search it, he said. Search my barns. Search my pastures. If you find proof, I will ride with you back to town. The offer landed harder than any accusation. Rhodes watched him carefully, measuring truth not by volume, but by steadiness. And if we find nothing? The sheriff asked. Elias lowered the sign slowly until it rested against his leg. Then you bring that plank back to town, he said, and you decide what kind of men carved it. The wind carried the scent of dry grass across the yard. One by one, riders shifted, uncertainty creeping where certainty had stood that morning. Suspicion had felt simple at the cedar tree. Here, under open sky and offered scrutiny, it felt smaller. Rhodes looked north toward the distant canyon, then back at the men beside him. We ride, he said at last. Not toward town, not toward the house, but toward the place none of them had wanted to examine. They rode north in a line that no longer looked certain, the dust from their horses trailing low and thin behind them as the land shifted from open prairie into broken ground and scattered stone. Elias Mercer watched from the fence until the last rider dipped beyond the rise. Then he turned toward the house, without a word. Lila remained on the porch, hands wrapped around the tin cup he had given her, eyes following the horizon as if she could still see them. They will not like what they find, she said quietly. Elias paused near the well, drawing up a bucket with steady pulls on the rope. Truth is rarely liked, he answered. It is only endured. He carried the bucket to the trough and let the water spill in, the sound clear and simple against the hush of afternoon. 12 miles north of town, the world felt wider, less eager to judge, yet even here the weight of Dry Creek pressed close. Lila stepped down from the porch and moved slowly across the yard, her strength returning in careful measures. Why did you tell them about the canyon? She asked. Elias leaned his forearms on the fence rail and looked out over his pasture, where cattle grazed undisturbed. Because I saw fresh tracks there 2 mornings ago, he said. Boot prints mixed with hoof marks. Not Apache moccasins. Not ranch hands from town either. Someone who knows how to stay between lines. Lila absorbed this in silence. A hawk circled high overhead, its shadow sliding across the grass like a passing thought. You think they will admit it if they are wrong? She asked after a moment. Elias did not answer right away. He watched the wind ripple through the field, bending the grass in ways that never argued with the direction they were given. Men do not like to be wrong, he said at last, but they dislike being exposed more. The sun drifted lower, casting long bars of light. Across the barn door, hours passed slow, marked only by the creak of the windmill and the distant lowing of cattle. Near dusk, the faint echo of hooves returned from the north, this time uneven, no longer riding in a proud formation. Elias straightened before the riders came fully into view. Sheriff Calvin Rhodes led them back, dust coating his coat and hat, eyes fixed ahead with a heaviness that had not been there before. Behind him, Harold Dunn no longer rode upright with accusation. His shoulders had rounded, and his gaze stayed down toward his horse's mane. Thomas Wilkes avoided looking toward the house at all. They stopped at the fence without speaking, as though the land itself demanded they measure their next words carefully. Rhodes dismounted this time, boots landing firm in the dirt. He held something in his hand, not a weapon, not a badge, but a strip of torn burlap with a brand mark burned into it. We found a makeshift pen in the canyon, he said quietly, hidden between the rocks. Stolen cattle were there, not moved through town, held north, ready to be driven east after dark. He lifted the burlap slightly. The brand belongs to Dunn's cousin in Cheyenne. He has been in debt for months. The wind seemed to still. Dunn's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Elias did not smile. He did not nod. He only looked at the men who had ridden out with certainty and returned with something heavier than dust. And in that quiet, the rope on the porch rail felt heavier than ever. No one spoke for a long moment after Sheriff Calvin Rhodes finished. The strip of burlap hung from his hand like a confession that had not yet found its voice. The late sun dipped low behind the barn, casting the yard in long shadows that stretched between the men like lines drawn in the dirt. Harold Dunn finally lifted his head, but not toward Elias Mercer. His gaze drifted past the house, past the fence, out to the open land where his cattle grazed somewhere under the same sky. My cousin would not, he began, then stopped. The words did not carry weight anymore. Rhodes folded the burlap once and slid it into his coat pocket. Your cousin has been buying feed he could not afford, he said evenly. And he has been seen near the canyon more than once. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He simply placed the truth where it belonged, out in the open air. Thomas Wilkes removed his hat and wiped his brow, though the heat had begun to fade. Then we were wrong, he said quietly, the admission barely louder than the windmill turning behind the house. The sentence settled heavy in the yard. Elias stood still, hands resting loosely at his sides, the rope still coiled on the porch rail behind him, the wooden sign leaning against the post where he had left it. He did not demand apology. He did not ask for acknowledgement. He only waited. Lila stepped forward then, slow and steady, until she stood beside him in full view. She did not hide her face. She did not lower her eyes. She simply stood. Dunn's gaze flicked toward her and then away, as if looking too long might force him to confront something inside himself he had avoided for years. We thought. He started again, but the sentence fell apart before it could finish. Rhodes drew a long breath. Thought is not proof, he said, and fear is not law. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant water, simple things that had nothing to do with pride or blame. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm, almost tired. You rode out this morning certain, he said. You rode back uncertain. That is closer to justice than you were before. Wilkes looked toward Lila. My wife will want you back at the camp, he said softly. If you are willing. Lila did not answer right away. She looked at the men who had watched her beneath a cedar tree, then at the house behind her where she had been given water without question. I will come back when I choose, she said. It was not defiance. It was dignity. Dunn shifted in his saddle, then swung down slowly, boots landing in the dirt. He walked to the fence, stopping a few feet short of crossing it. His eyes moved to the wooden sign on the porch. That should not exist, he muttered. Elias followed his gaze. It does, he replied. What you do next decides what it means. The sun dipped lower still, turning the sky copper and gold. In that fading light, the men of Dry Creek stood, not as a mob, not as accusers, but as neighbors forced to measure themselves against the silence of a rancher who had refused to look away. The light drained slowly from the sky, leaving a soft gray that blurred the edges of men and fences alike. No one hurried to leave. The weight of what had been discovered in the canyon lingered heavier than dust on their coats. Sheriff Calvin Rhodes stepped closer to the porch this time, not as an officer, but as a man who understood something had shifted. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, looking first at Elias Mercer, then at Lila. The cattle will be returned, he said quietly, and there will be questions asked in Cheyenne. He did not say what those questions might cost Harold Dunn's family. He did not need to. Dunn stood apart from the others now, hands resting on the top rail of the fence, staring at the ground between his boots. Pride had carried him north that afternoon. Shame kept him rooted in place. I let anger speak for me, he said at last, voice low, nearly lost to the wind. I did not wait for proof. He lifted his eyes toward Lila, but only for a second. You did not deserve that. It was not a full apology. It was not polished, but it was the first honest thing he had offered all day. Lila regarded him without bitterness, without triumph. The porch lantern behind her flickered to life as Elias reached back and lit it, a small circle of warm light pushing against the dark. Deserve has little to do with what happens, she said softly. It has more to do with what you choose after. The words settled into the yard like seeds on dry soil. Thomas Wilkes shifted his weight and cleared his throat. My wife will come tomorrow, he said. She will want to speak with you herself. Lila nodded once, neither accepting nor refusing, simply acknowledging. Elias stepped forward and picked up the wooden sign from where it leaned against the post. He held it out toward Rhodes. The carved letters caught the lantern glow, shadows deep in each groove. Take it back, Elias said. Nail it to the wall of the jail if you have to. Let folks read it in daylight. Rhodes hesitated, then reached out and took the plank. It seemed heavier in his hands than burlap or badge. It will not be hidden, he said. The men began to drift back toward their horses, movements slower now, less certain. No one spoke of riding in anger again. No one mentioned punishment or pride. The prairie night rose around them, cool and wide. the first stars appearing above the ridge. Dunn mounted without meeting anyone's eyes. Wilkes lingered a moment longer, offering a small nod to Lila before turning away. One by one, they rode south toward Dry Creek, not in formation, not in triumph, but in quiet reflection. When the last hoofbeat faded into the dark, Elias remained at the fence, watching until the horizon swallowed them. Lila stepped beside him, the lantern light catching in her eyes. "Will they change?" she asked. Elias considered the question as the wind moved through the grass, steady and patient. "Some will," he said. "The rest will remember tonight, when they are tempted not to." He rested his forearms on the fence rail, gaze fixed on the open land. Out here, justice did not thunder. It arrived in silence, carried by those willing to stand still when others moved too fast. The night settled deep over the ranch, cool air slipping through the open windows and carrying the scent of sage and distant water. Elias Mercer sat at the small wooden table near the lantern, a tin cup of coffee untouched in front of him. Across the room, Lila rested in the chair by the hearth, a wool blanket folded over her shoulders though the fire had burned low to embers. Neither spoke for a long while. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere beyond the creek, the sound long and lonely but honest. "They will hang that sign where everyone can see it," Lila said at last, her voice softer now that the day had drained from it. Elias nodded once. "They will," he answered, "and every man who walks past will remember he stood beneath it." He rose and crossed the room to the shelf near the door where he kept ledgers and letters tied with twine. From among them, he drew a folded paper, edges worn from handling. He placed it on the table, but did not open it. "What is that?" Lila asked. Elias rested a hand over the paper. 8 years ago," he said, "my wife was blamed for selling feed to the wrong trader. Folks said she was helping outsiders undercut prices. No one asked her. No one checked the books." His voice remained steady, but something older moved beneath it. By the time truth came out, she had already carried the shame. People do not forget accusations, even when they are false. Lila listened without interruption, eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Is that why you did not walk away this morning?" she asked. Elias looked toward the window where the dark prairie stretched unseen. "I walked away once," he said. "I do not intend to do it again." The wind pressed lightly against the house, rattling the loose edge of a shutter. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Lila shifted in her chair. "If they had found nothing in the canyon," she said slowly, "would you still have stood there?" Elias met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. There was no pride in the word, only certainty. The fire gave a small crackle as the last ember collapsed into ash. Lila drew the blanket closer around her shoulders and studied the man across from her. The lines in his face, shaped more by patience than by anger. "Tomorrow," she said, "when Mrs. Wilkes comes, I will go back to work. Not because I owe them, but because I will not let fear decide where I belong." Elias inclined his head. "Belonging is not granted," he replied. "It is lived." Outside, the stars brightened one by one, scattered across the wide Wyoming sky. Somewhere far to the south, in the small jail of Dry Creek, a wooden sign leaned against a wall, its carved letters catching lantern light just as they had on the prairie. No one had hidden it. No one had burned it. It waited, silent and visible, like the truth itself. Elias extinguished the lantern and let darkness fill the room. In that quiet, with nothing left to prove and no one left to argue with, justice felt less like a victory and more like a steady breath taken at the end of a long day. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light stretching across the prairie and slipping through the thin curtains of Elias Mercer's ranch house. He was awake before the sun cleared the horizon, seated at the table with the ledger still open beside him, though he had not written a single line. Across the room, Lila stood by the window, watching the land as if measuring it anew. The air carried the clean chill of early day, the kind that made every sound sharper, from the windmill turning to the distant call of cattle beyond the fence. "They will be waiting," she said quietly. Elias poured fresh coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her without comment. "Let them," he replied. There was no defiance in his tone, only steadiness. By mid-morning, a wagon approached from the south, wheels cutting slow tracks through the dust. Thomas Wilkes sat beside his wife, Margaret Wilkes, a woman with gray woven into her dark hair and eyes that missed little. She stepped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, skirts brushing the dry grass as she walked toward the porch. Elias remained by the door, while Lila stepped forward to meet her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Margaret studied Lila's face, the faint marks at her wrists, the calm set of her shoulders. "You should have been brought home last night," Margaret said at last, voice firm but not harsh. "You are part of my camp, and I will not have my workers treated as rumor." Lila held her gaze. "I chose to stay," she answered. Margaret gave a small nod, as if that mattered more than any explanation. Behind her, Thomas Wilkes removed his hat and looked toward Elias. "The sheriff posted the sign inside the jail," he said quietly. "No one can walk in without seeing it." Elias inclined his head once. "Good." Margaret turned back to Lila. "Come back with us," she said. "Work if you wish. Rest if you need. But do not stay away because of shame that is not yours." The words settled into the yard like something solid and dependable. Lila glanced toward Elias, not seeking permission, only acknowledgement. He met her eyes and gave the slightest nod. "Your place is where you decide it is," he said. Lila stepped down from the porch and walked toward the wagon, her stride steady, no trace of the hesitation that had marked her the day before. As she climbed up beside Margaret, the wind caught her hair and lifted it back from her face, revealing not fear, but resolve. Thomas gathered the reins, and the wagon turned south toward Dry Creek, wheels rolling over the same ground that had carried accusation less than 24 hours earlier. Elias watched until they disappeared beyond the rise, the ranch falling quiet once more. The prairie stretched wide before him, unchanged and patient. Somewhere in town, men would read carved words in daylight and remember the cost of speaking too quickly. Elias rested his hands on the porch rail and drew a slow breath. The land had not demanded noise to set things right. It had required only one man to stand still when others rushed forward. And in that stillness, something lasting had begun. Dry Creek did not wake easily the next morning. The sun rose the same way it always had, spreading pale gold across the false fronts of the saloon and the general store, but the town felt different, as if it had swallowed something too large to ignore. Sheriff Calvin Rhodes unlocked the jail just after dawn, stepping inside with a lantern still burning low from the night. The wooden sign leaned against the far wall where he had placed it, not hidden behind his desk, not turned face down. He set it upright against the bars so that anyone entering would have to face the carved words before speaking a single complaint. Outside, the first townsmen drifted in for their usual morning talk, boots scuffing the boardwalk, voices quiet. Harold Dunn arrived later than most. He paused at the jail door when he saw the sign through the open frame, the letters dark and unmistakable in the early light. He stood there longer than necessary, hat in his hands, reading the sentence that had once felt justified and now felt narrow. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. Across town, Margaret Wilkes moved through the sheep camp with deliberate calm, assigning work as she always had, though her eyes lingered on Lila when she passed her a bucket near the well. Lila accepted it with steady hands and carried it toward the pens, the morning wind lifting dust around her boots. A few ranch hands glanced her way, then quickly returned to their tasks. The looks were different now, less sharp, more uncertain. Thomas Wilkes worked beside her without comment, matching her pace, as if ordinary routine could help mend what had nearly been broken. By midday, word had reached every storefront and barn that stolen cattle had been found in the North Canyon, and that Dunn's cousin in Cheyenne would soon answer for it. The rumor that had once traveled like wildfire now moved slower, heavier, weighed down by fact. At the saloon, men who had spoken loudly 2 days earlier found themselves staring into their cups, conversations faltering whenever someone mentioned the canyon. Rhodes walked the length of Main Street that afternoon, not to enforce order, but to observe it. He noticed how many eyes drifted toward the jail window when they passed, how many steps slowed near the doorway. The sign did not shout. It did not accuse. It simply existed. 12 miles north, Elias Mercer repaired a section of fence that winter winds had loosened months before. He worked with measured strokes of his hammer, the sound carrying clean across the open land. He had not ridden into town. He had not asked for acknowledgement. The prairie did not require witnesses for what had been done. As he straightened and looked out over his pasture, he saw cattle grazing in steady lines, heads down, unaware of the tension that had gripped men only hours before. The land had not changed, but Dry Creek had felt the weight of its own reflection, and that weight would linger longer than dust on boots. In the quiet space between accusation and truth, something had shifted, not loudly, not with spectacle, but with the slow recognition that dignity, once nearly denied, had stood its ground and refused to fall. Autumn settled over Dry Creek with a quiet authority that did not ask permission. The cottonwoods along the creek turned brittle gold, their leaves drifting down in slow spirals that caught against fence posts and wagon wheels. Weeks had passed since the day the canyon gave up its secret, and the town had learned to move again, though not quite the same way. The wooden sign remained inside the jail, propped where the afternoon sun struck it through the narrow window. Sheriff Calvin Rhodes had refused more than one suggestion to burn it. Let it weather, he had said. Let it remind. And it did. Men who stepped inside to settle minor disputes found their eyes drawn first to those carved words, and their voices lowered without being told. Harold Dunn had ridden north twice since then, not in anger, but in quiet obligation. The first time, he had stopped at Elias Mercer's fence with a sack of feed tied behind his saddle. He had not crossed the gate until Elias nodded. For the trouble, Dunn had said, though both men knew feed could not balance what had nearly been lost. Elias had accepted it without comment, setting the sack inside the barn as if it were nothing more than routine trade. The second time, Dunn had come alone at dusk, hat in his hands, and stood for several minutes before speaking. I let fear speak louder than sense, he had said. Elias had studied him in the fading light and replied only, then let sense speak longer next time. It was not forgiveness spoken aloud. It was permission to do better. At the sheep camp, Lila moved with a steadiness that had become its own answer. Margaret Wilkes placed more trust in her with each passing day, asking her opinion on supplies, on routes, on which buyers to avoid when prices dipped unfairly. The other hands watched and slowly adjusted their posture around her, no longer out of caution, but respect earned without demand. One afternoon, as a wagon from Cheyenne rattled through town carrying official papers regarding Dunn's cousin, Lila walked past the jail and paused. She stepped inside, not hurried, not hesitant. The sign stood where it always had. She read the carved sentence once more, the letters no longer cutting as sharply as they had beneath the cedar tree. Rhodes noticed her from his desk, but did not interrupt. After a moment, Lila reached out and turned the plank slightly so that it faced the wall instead of the door. Not hidden, not destroyed, just shifted. She met the sheriff's eyes. It has done its work, she said softly. Rhodes considered that, then gave a slow nod. 12 miles north, Elias repaired another stretch of fence, the rhythm of hammer against nail steady and untroubled. The prairie rolled wide and open before him, wind moving through dry grass in long, patient waves. Out here, no monument marked what had nearly happened. No crowd gathered to celebrate what had been avoided. Yet something durable had taken root between town and ranch, between accusation and truth. It did not announce itself. It simply endured, quiet as the land itself. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north in long gray curtains that softened the edges of fence posts and buried the prairie under a quiet layer of white. Dry Creek moved slower in the cold, boots crunching along frozen boardwalks, breath rising in pale clouds that faded as quickly as spoken words. Inside the small jail, the wooden sign no longer faced the room. It leaned against the back wall now, its carved letters dulled by time and dust, visible only if a man chose to look. Most did not. They did not need to. The lesson had already settled deeper than wood. One morning, as frost clung to the windows, Sheriff Calvin Rhodes stepped outside to find Elias Mercer waiting beside the hitching rail, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He had ridden in without announcement, without expectation. Rhodes nodded once in greeting. "Cattle are steady," he said, as if that were reason enough for the visit. Elias inclined his head. "So is the weather," he replied. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, two men who understood that order did not always come from law, and peace did not always come from force. Across town, Lila walked beside Margaret Wilkes, carrying a ledger under her arm as they crossed from the store to the wagon. Snow creaked beneath their boots. A few townsfolk tipped their hats as they passed, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, but with the small acknowledgement reserved for neighbors rather than strangers. Lila returned each nod with calm assurance. No trace of the uncertainty that had once shadowed her steps. The prairie beyond town lay wide and pale, stretching 12 miles north toward the ranch where a cedar tree still stood alone against the sky. Its branches were bare now, dark against the winter light, no rope hanging from them, no crowd gathered beneath. Only wind, moving steady through the open land. That afternoon, Elias rode back toward his spread, horse hooves muffled by fresh snow. He did not look toward the canyon, nor toward the town. He looked ahead, toward fences that needed checking and cattle that needed tending. The work remained the same as it had always been. Yet something unseen had shifted, like a gate rehung properly on its hinges. Near dusk, he paused at the rise before his house and glanced back once toward Dry Creek, a thin line of smoke rising from chimneys into the cold sky. He removed his hat briefly, not in salute, not in triumph, but in quiet recognition that the land had asked something of him, and he had answered. Then he set his hat back on his head and rode on. Out here, justice had not arrived with thunder or raised voices. It had come in the form of a man who chose to stand when others turned away, and a town that chose, slowly and imperfectly, to look at itself in the clear light of day. The prairie kept no record of the moment. It did not carve names into stone or build monuments of memory. It simply endured, wide and patient, holding the silence where dignity had stood its ground and refused to fall.